Hi, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm Erin Moat. I'm the Executive Director of Innovate EDU, and welcome to Money Moves, how to plan now to utilize different types of federal funding to build your modern data ecosystem. We have folks joining, and so we're going to give everybody about 2 minutes to join as we get started. As you come into the room, we'd love if you'd introduce yourself into the chat. Tell us your name and what role you have in your organization, whether you're with a school district, whether you're with an individual school, or maybe you're with an ed tech vendor, a state, an education service agency, or some other not-for-profit organization. We're really excited to kick off this webinar. For our folks who are joining us today and might need an accommodation to make this webinar work for them and for the content to be more inclusive, please go ahead and reach out to our moderator in the chat, Jonathan. If you need anything, including captioning of the webinar, a transcript after the webinar, we will be reading the questions from the chat aloud for our folks who might be visually impaired. But any other accommodations, please do reach out to our team. We're here to make sure that this content is accessible to you. Welcome, Carrie from West Virginia. Going to continue to wait for folks to add themselves in the chat. Go ahead and just add your name, where you're from, who you're coming to. Welcome, Maureen from EdFi. Hi, Jonathan from Innovate EDU. Again, Jonathan's our moderator, joining us from Brooklyn, New York. Hi, Chris, joining us from Lee Montessori Public Charter Schools in DC. Hi, Cody, joining us from the Center for Democracy and Technology, a Project Unicorn partner in DC. Great. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, keep introducing yourself in the chat. We're really excited to have great participation. We also know that many of you might be listening to this webinar or consuming this content after the fact that we're participating live. We'll make sure to share our contact information after the conclusion of the webinar in some of the final slides. And feel free to reach out to all of us on social media or via email if you have questions after the webinar concludes. We're here to provide you with a ton of content today. And so we're happy to give you what we hope is lots of knowledge, but we're going to leave lots of time for questions as well. So I'm really excited to join two amazing partners. I'm just going to spend a couple minutes gushing about the folks at Afton and the folks at the Learn platform. So Project Unicorn is a coalition of 16 educational organizations who are looking to advance data interoperability in K-12 education. We're really excited to always partner to try to increase knowledge in the field. And the reason that we are taking part in this two-part series, we'll talk about part two at the end of this webinar, is because we've been getting a lot of questions from our partner districts, LEAs, and schools about the ARP ESSER money. How do they use this money in a smart way to invest in their data ecosystem? How do they use this money to modernize what they're doing? How do they understand how to use this money versus E-rate money? How do they use this money to be smart about the investments that they're making? What about some of the funding provisions? Is this title money? Is this not title money? Seems really unclear. And so one of the great things about being a unicorn is you can call in fellow unicorns. And that's what we consider our friends at Afton and the Learn platform, two really smart organizations who are doing really great work. I've known Scott for a good amount of time. Actually, Scott has known me since I founded a charter school in downtown Brooklyn and gave me a ton of great financial planning advice when we were getting started. I often credit Scott for helping us be able to afford real estate that allowed our schools to grow to 3 different school networks and now serve over 1,100 students, some of whom this weekend we learned got into Harvard. So super exciting. And so really so pleased to have Scott on this call, because not only does he give great advice to schools and districts throughout the country, but he actually helps provide really usable templates that are very practical to schools and districts about not only how to plan in the short term, but how to really achieve your long-term goals. And then my friend Carl Roktanis from Learn Platform. So many great tools at Project Unicorn. We partnered with the Learn Platform not only to provide actionable knowledge about what products are interoperable and what aren't, who signed the pledge and who hasn't, but Carl's really pushing the envelope when it comes to providing data around equity and what it looks like to have access to data about what's working and what's not in your school district. He's going to share more, so I'm not going to steal their thunder, but Carl and Scott, if you just want to say a quick hello, and I'm going to ask you, as this is the 4th of May, and May the 4th be with you day, to tell us, who are you in the Star Wars universe, if you could be one character? Carl, you kick us off.
Well, thank you, Erin. It's a pleasure to be with you. So happy to be a unicorn with you. And I'll, I think I'd be honored if I was Rey in the new versions, and my 3 daughters would be too. So I'm going to go with Rey.
This is a great day to do this because it's May the 4th be with you. We could do this all day, but I have to go with a classic of Han Solo because it's just Han, and it's just been too fun to watch him over the years. But we didn't make it through till the end, spoiler alert, but still a lot of fun to watch Han over the years.
Well, sorry.
Good choice.
I know, that is a good choice. I've always wanted to be an Ewok. I've always felt a deep affinity to being an Ewok. So I don't know. That's who I've always wanted to be, if I could. So today, we've already gotten through the introduction. So check, we're already there. We're going to talk a little bit about framing the financial conversation. We're then going to turn to EdTech funding opportunities with Carl. We're going to spend a lot of time on the Q&A, so please start typing those questions in the chat as we're going through. We'll stack them up for the end, and then we'll talk a little bit about part 2 of this webinar series. Couple asks from the Project Unicorn team. Be a trooper. Take our current school system data survey that's out right now. We are trying to get a snapshot nationally of what data interoperability, privacy look like right now in school districts and single site schools, charters, private schools, education service organizations throughout the country. National survey, all the data is anonymized. We'll publish a national snapshot in September. We'll do this every year. What we're really trying to do is publish data for the sector about where we're at, where we need to go, identify gaps. And so please take part. It takes about 15 minutes. I want to be clear, it's not a 3 to 5 minute survey. It takes about 15 minutes. If you go on our website, there's a guide about how and sort of to bring your team in to answer the questions and how to prepare to take the survey. You can actually download the whole survey before you take it. If you want to fill it in before you cruise the form, it would help us tremendously and frankly help the sector tremendously to get an honest snapshot about the good, the bad, and the ugly of where our data systems are in education. And frankly, there's a lot of ugly. So help us, help you, and help communicate to all stakeholders, federal, state, and the philanthropic community about where investments need to go in order for us to modernize our data ecosystem. So that's my pitch. Be a trooper, take the school system data survey. The other resource I wanted to share today is this helpful resource from Baby Yoda and I called Better EdTech Buying for Educators. This is probably one of our most popular resources. It explores 5 domains when you're thinking about EdTech buying interoperability is just one. There's privacy, there's curriculum alignment, so on and so forth. I like to call this resource out as you're thinking about going into the summer and thinking about renewals. Please pick this up from our website. You can download the guide. One of the most helpful resources we've heard from schools and districts as they're thinking about considering what tools they might want to purchase and as they're thinking about a renewal framework. And this fits really nicely, I think, into what Carl's going to talk about today as well. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it wide over to my friend Scott. Scott, take it away. Tell us everything we need to know in 15 minutes or less about ARP ESSER funds.
No problem there, that's for sure, right? Not complex at all. Nice to meet you all again. Scott Milan from Afton Partners. Afton, we empower education leaders with effective financial strategies. That's what we do. And our work, you'll probably notice from the angle that we have from this discussion, is our work really focuses on work with LEAs. We work a lot with charter LEAs and districts as well on all sorts of financial matters that they're dealing with. And currently, everybody that is working in a district now or a charter, or anybody supporting them knows they're going through a budget season like no other. Not just trying to plan coming out of the pandemic, but also trying to plan the best use of the federal funds that are available to them as well. So we've been really in the weeds working with some of these schools and leaders, and this is a great opportunity to step back a little bit, I think, for us. So we'll just go through some of the high level of what we know today and what we're still learning. So it's just the overview of the federal funding as we know them, the different relief packages today, the three different ones, the CARES initial funding, which seemed enormous back in March of 2020, over a year ago at $13 billion, and wonderful acronyms as well, moving from CARES to SRSA, or ESSER 2, December of 2020 at $54 billion, and then ARPA, ESSER 3, just this past year for a total of about $200 billion, which is, again, a remarkable amount of money that districts and SEAs are planning to utilize in the next few years. So when we look at just the different packages, the different relief packages themselves and some of the timing that are associated with each one of them, CARES, the first package, the smallish, I guess, package, still larger than all of Race to the Top by 3x, must be obligated by September of 2022, and then sequentially each from there, larger packages, a longer time frame to obligate the funds. So that's the first package is about $250 per pupil. The second, ESSER 2, obligated by September of 2023, or $1,100 per pupil. And lastly, $123 billion for the ARP or ARPA. If you include ACT at the end there, ESSER 3, it's $2,400 per pupil, must be obligated by September of 2024, but can be spent through FY25. So there's some flexibility in the timing of spend there. There's flexibility all over the place, really, with this funding, and I think that's one of the key messages here. So for how much you get when you get it, I think this is working with both charters and district LEAs. How much funding you're allocated, it's through the SEAs, and it's allocated based on the proportion of Title I funding each district received in FY20 is how the funding is being allocated, and it's through either directly to district or charter LEAs from the SEAs, and then with the charter within an LEA, it depends on the LEA itself. We talked about when you need to obligate it, but when you get the funding, SEAs have until January 22 for ESSER 2 and until March of 22 to allocate ARPA and ESSER 3. Which seems like there's some time involved there, but really there's obviously a lot of planning that's going on right now, which we'll talk more about, but developing these plans and thinking about not just the short term, but the long term is going to be really important. Use and reporting requirements is evolving over time, but there are some reports that we've received guidance from Ed on to receive the final third of the ARPA funding there is a reporting requirement from the SEAs, and they've shared a template with the SEAs on what that reporting requirement looks like. But it includes, I'm sorry, I have notes over here that I'm referencing, so I'm going back and forth between some screens. But a couple of the things that are included in the reporting are assessing the impact of COVID and coordinating the use of funds across all of the different relief packages. So trying to weave together and strategically think about all of the funding that's available. But when you're thinking about assessing the impact of COVID, certainly data will feed into a lot of the reporting that we're going to talk about, not just from a financial standpoint, but understanding where every student is and what their needs are, because there's quite a focus, at least when we're talking about the largest package with ARPA, on equity, on allocating the funding and utilizing the funding. So we also want to note that there's other sources of funding available as well. Put some links in here. I think we'll be sharing this out as well, but there's FEMA funding, the focus on disaster funding, but there's state-specific relief funding, but E-rate as well. And I would just encourage you all to look into E-rate availability. It's for Wi-Fi connectivity and hotspots, but there may be other availability for those funds as well. I think it's about $7 billion that's available through E-rate, as well as child care credits. And finally, state and local funding for service possibilities for testing, COVID-19 testing. We've of course heard the good news that vaccine will be available for older students, primarily impacting high school, and maybe as soon as the summer, students will be able to have vaccine availability. But we know that's not going to impact elementary schools, at least for a while. So testing is probably going to be with us for some period of time. So it's something to be aware of, that we have other sources of funding as well, in addition to what we have available for the significant amounts that we have available for all the other relief funding we talked about. So, okay, use requirements for each one of these. What's interesting, the guru of just ed finance and funding for K-12 schools, Marguerite Rosa, what she said when they're looking at the legislation, and when you read the text behind it as well, she said, we're challenged to find something districts couldn't spend the money on, which is remarkable for any type of federal funding. But this funding is remarkably flexible. That doesn't come, it means that there could be more risks associated with it because the funding is flexible. And it's something I think we'll talk about in a minute when we talk about reporting and data requirements here. So acceptable uses for both ESSER 2 and 3, again, with the flexible potential uses of it, reducing class sizes, hiring support staff. So you can hire staff, you can purchase instructional technology, which we'll talk more about, personal protective equipment, repairing ventilation systems, facilities improvements across the board. You can invest in facilities to offset some of the ongoing potential costs that you have for your operation. It's a way to offset some long-term costs here. So it's remarkable. There's a lot of flexibility for LEAs to create their plans. As part of ESSER 3 and ARPA, 20% must address learning loss with effective strategies or proven effective strategies, as is articulated in the legislation. But again, still flexible for the LEA to determine what those strategies happen to be. And there are some funds. There are some funds. I believe 5% of the total funds in the SEA to support learning loss as well. They must make a public plan to return into in-person schooling safely. Again, part of the reporting requirement we talked about earlier. And there's a local maintenance of equity. And like I mentioned, there's a big focus on equity. And this is a provision of ARPA to ensure that high needs districts maintain at least the funding levels that they had prior to the pandemic, as they do subsequent. And so there's a maintenance of effort across the state, but also a maintenance of equity component to this as well. Lastly, the LEAs have roughly 3 to 4 years to spend funding. Like we talked about, SRSA obligated funds by September 23, ARPA September 24 through FY25. So we have 4 years effectively to utilize the funding, but we need to plan today effectively to get there. And that's what I want to make sure, the last point I want to make here before turning this over to Carl. In our view, there's just arguably been no bigger moment in the last several decades for schools to step back, plan, and implement and fully resourced innovations in student learning and supports. It's sort of easy to say, but it's a challenge to find the time to step back. It's a challenge to find the time to get all of this done. And so we know that there's a capacity issue both on the state level as well as LEAs to be able to effectively build these plans. But we know that that's critical for the long-term success of leveraging these funds. And in our view, there's 3 primary areas: school network planning, instructional and student supports, I think significant engagement of communities and impacted stakeholders, and then a financial component as well as we're building plans. For instructional and student supports planning, there are a few areas that we're obviously focused on students in relief, identify and quantify recovery needs. Again, this can really prove an opportunity to invest in data requirements, data needs, understanding what individual students need to understand what learning loss actually means and understand what strategies are actually working and going well beyond just high stakes testing. Target those investments again to who need it most, invest in proven high impact strategies, and monitor and adjust over time. We know that mistakes are going to be made. Again, these are high opportunity, high risk funds. We know mistakes are going to be made, and we know that it's going to be imperative for districts to understand how they're investing these dollars, track the dollars they're investing, understand and lay out what the outcomes that they intend to seek with the utilization of those funds, track those outcomes and pivot as they need to, and be transparent about that as much as possible. Lastly, as we're talking about the guidance from the Department of Ed on use of funding for technology, they've said purchase some of the things that they've identified as opportunity areas or areas that specifically ARPA funds could be used for. They've said purchasing educational technology, hardware, software, connectivity, assistive technology, adaptive equipment for students that aids in regular and substantive educational interaction between students and their classroom instructors, including students from low-income families and children with disabilities. So there's a specific call out in the legislation about utilization of technology or utilization of funds for technologies, particularly for low-income students. I'm going to make a few other points before handing it over to Carl here. I won't go through all of these, of course, but these are some of the examples that we're seeing and working with LEAs. And of course, one of the key pieces that we're seeing is building a longer-term instructional technology plan, which is right here, that aligns with your financial plan. I mean, that's just a best practice that we're recommending and working with LEAs on right now, is building those long-term plans. That's operational in nature, it's education and student outcomes, technology as well as financial. So getting to that from a financial planning standpoint, we are supporting just developing a long-term multi-year plan. Doesn't have to be too complex, but just focus on what your opportunities are for the next several years. There are administrative burdens from a financial standpoint. There are administrative burdens just to have the capacity to plan. Just understanding these exist it's just important to acknowledge that when you're building these plans in the first place. From a risk standpoint, we won't go too deep into this. Is some of the work we do with the CFO friends, but I think it's important as in technology, CIOs and CTOs understanding where your CFO is coming from. As you're working to put this plan together with your chief academic officer, your board of directors, your CEO, your superintendent. But the risks associated with the funding are at least 3 from our standpoint: sustainability, liquidity, and accountability over time. The sustainability risk, we talked about the money is going to run out in 4 years. Build that long-term financial plan and engage your board and leadership and update that plan as much as you possibly can for the outcomes that you're seeing and use of those funds. Liquidity risk, I think this is important to understand. Technology in particular, if you have contracts or large contracts that might be, you might seek those large contracts because this is effectively one-time funding just over multiple years. This is sizable, massive funding, and it's reimbursement based. And so some districts and charter LEAs may have a liquidity challenge as they're ramping up services. And so that's helpful to understand when you're crafting strategies with your leadership on how you're developing strategies on use of funds for IT investments. Lastly, from an accountability standpoint, it's a risk, and we view it also as the biggest opportunity as well. As we talked about, it's a high public interest on this. This is 50, again, all this funds, 200 billion is 50 times the size of Race to the Top from 2010, which seemed like a pretty high profile program then. This is an incredible opportunity. And so building in a structure focused on data, building in a structure on student outcomes, use of funds, strategies that can be shared with other LEAs, other SEAs, strategies that are working, and a focus on being transparent on the use of those funds and the strategies that are being used. So we're really supporting the use of transparent reporting, student data, financial data, and outcomes. Lastly, we've seen there's a lot of resources that we're including in a separate document that's going to be shared with you. One of the resources that we've seen that lays out effective strategies for the use of these additional funds is this P20 Council Learning Renewal Resource Guide. It seems pretty wonky, and it is, but that's what we need sometimes. It's for the state of Illinois for their pre-K through grade 20 or 20-year-old program, or just the education strategy. And so they have a nice section in there just about use of funds for instructional technologies. I think they crafted this even before ARPA. It's more just thinking through different strategies and how they can be documented and shared across across LEAs within the state. So I just wanted to highlight that as a resource. So a lot of great things obviously are happening with this funding. It's a massive opportunity, as we all know, and some of this is about just understanding what the risks are and then mitigating some of those risks as much as we can with all potential investments, but including IT as well. So with that, I will hand it over to Carl to talk about some of those opportunities for IT.
Thanks, Scott. Great overview. I think some of the key challenges that you highlight is this, where are we now, but we have to plan in the long term, given, cash flows, 3 years, when do we encumber versus when we spend. And then, of course, if we do it right, we could actually make those funds last even further or help support services into years 4, 5, and 6 if we're, aligning that with our overall strategy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing across the country as it relates to education technology now, and a couple ways we're seeing LEAs really jump in and states to make those decisions. A little bit of data here. EdTech was already growing at a pretty significant clip prior to 2020. What you see there, 2017-18, you see on average school districts were accessing over 500 different EdTech tools every month. And that just continued to grow. And if you talk to curriculum instruction leaders, district leaders, technology leaders, they might say, hey, I got contracts for 100 to 200 products. My teachers are using some stuff. Well, it continued to expand. And as we know, there's a lot of different things that go into that. Post-COVID, it grew and has since grown to almost 1,400 different EdTech tools being used every month. This is based on every school district with more than 1,000 students. It includes charter networks and others. And what we're seeing is on average and hearing from folks is that's more than 70 different math and English language arts tools. They're using more than one learning management system, more than one single sign-on provider. Well, of course, if you've got more than one, it's not single. There's just a lot going on, and it feels more like the Wild West for a lot more people. And so we have outlined 5 E's, the letter E, 5 E's for driving some decision making as you think about your stimulus funds, and it all flows from equity. I should have mentioned, again, I'm Carl Rectanis, and I'm with Learn Platform, and our mission is to expand equitable engagement to the teaching and technology that works best for them. So this is not just about technology, it's about how do you drive that and equip that to drive the teaching and learning you want. And you have to look at equity. From there, we are going to dig in just quickly into engagement. I think evidence is my favorite E, and then efficiency and effectiveness. So with that, let me see. We know that even prior to COVID, there were equity gaps that existed. We knew that, and it was no different in digital learning. The green line you're looking at is EdTech engagement in school districts with with less than 25% free and reduced lunch. Those are more affluent districts. The green line, and the blue line is what EdTech engagement looked like last year with all other districts, charters, and LEAs. You can see it was actively a K-shaped recovery last spring, right? Those who had affluence and access and other things, they actually started engaging more online than they were previously. And those in less affluent districts saw less online engagement, slower returns, but those gaps sort of changed and persisted over time as we headed into the fall. So there's a lot more EdTech engagement than there was, in the spring. There was a lot of planning and work that went on, but there is still a gap. We actually published information about this work every month last year, but I'm glad to share that last week we launched something called the National EdTech Equity Dashboard. It is similar to some of the charts that I just shared, but it is freely available. We've provided this with philanthropic support. And the reason we focus on that is because engagement, this is a look at EdTech engagement based on the racial and economic breakdowns of different districts. It gives us a sense of what those digital learning equity gaps look like. But I'm going to talk about why we should use that. I encourage you to check this out, share it, use it. It is freely available, and it is just to help you have some context around what's going on around the country as it relates to your own situation. And as you think about your own situation, I want to highlight the second E is about engagement. A lot of the conversation, Scott highlighted broadband funds that'll be available, about $7 billion in excess of what's previously been available. As a former CFO for schools, like the numbers that are getting thrown around right now, are stunning, to say the least. But if we only look at access, that is there broadband or a device? What's the broadband speed to the home or school? That actually is important. It's table stakes. Access and being able to connect is table stakes to online learning, but engagement is a leading indicator of the type of learning and outcomes, and it can be used for the 30 evidence. So access is important, but I highly encourage all LEAs to start looking at and measuring engagement. And to do that, any local education agency, charter, district can actually claim their own EdTech inventory dashboard with us. We make this available for free. There are certainly tools you can pay for that help with some of this, but we actually, because our other tools and technologies are used, which I'll share a little bit more about, this is freely available, and it does provide that type of equity and engagement. You can see how many EdTech products are used in your own district. how often, by whom, which student groups, et cetera. And it can get everybody on the same page. It takes about 30 minutes to activate across most school districts, if that long. So freely available. Highly encourage you to take advantage of that, but certainly measure engagement. And the reason, again, is my favorite E, evidence. There's a lot of talk. There's been, these words get thrown around a fair amount, but I want to talk about evidence real quick and clarify what we mean. Anybody who's seen Law and Order or CSI or any criminal procedural in the last few decades and might be hearing the donk donk in your head right now knows that evidence is local. The evidence in season 2, episode 4 of Law and Order does not apply to season 5, episode 6 in CSI Miami. It's not the same thing. But for a long time as educators, we've been required to use case studies or, maybe an evaluation that came from 4 years ago in another situation as quote unquote evidence. That's not evidence, it's marketing. That's okay, but and there's ways to inform your decisions. But when we talk about evidence, ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, actually outlines 4 levels of evidence. And it's very achievable. This is not something you necessarily need a third-party evaluator to do all those. This is highlighted for Title I, Title IV programs. So while there hasn't been guidance yet on how to respond with the reporting and evidence, there has been guidance on what evidence looks like. And in classic federal form, level 4 is the lowest, and level 1 is the highest level of evidence. But in level 4, you can demonstrate rationale. For educators, this is generally documenting your logic model or your theory of action, your theory of change. You can use these in the first few years of implementing an intervention, and I'm going to show you an example of moving through these levels of evidence. But as you start to move into level 3 and level 2 is required for future years to show evidence of activation and some impact on outcomes in level 2 and level 3. You don't actually have to get to level 1, which is a randomized control trial, but level 3 and level 2 you can use to drive that. Let me give you an example of what that looks like. Here's an actual example, Midwest Suburban District. You'll notice they're not huge. In fact, they're quite small compared to most districts. For some independent schools or what have you, this may feel large, but this is just to say you don't have to be, a massive organization. They actually have almost 100% free and reduced lunch, 95% Black Latinx population. You'll see in the first year what they did. They chose a core literacy implementation tool for their K through 5 students based on K3 literacy goals, teacher feedback and usability, reviews from others, alignment with their instructional model. Very valid for the use of the logic model and to benchmark from there where you're going and what you're trying to do. They then analyzed engagement data during the year to improve their implementation and take a look and make some decisions. As they moved into the second year, they evaluated that information against, they used our impact technology with their benchmark assessment scores from NWEA. And they found a net positive engagement level and positive effect size for their K through 3 students. But they didn't see the same impact or engagement with their 4th and 5th graders. So from there, what they're doing now, they're reviewing their implementation and support and best practices. They're adjusting the number of licenses they're purchasing. So they're allocating funds in a different way so they can allocate it in years 2 and 3. And they're using that to report and share with others. So that's one, as you think about evidence, just one example that you can start to use. I encourage 2 options. One, you can build your organization's capacity to run these types of evaluations or to interact. You can use tools like ours. We provide professional development, but as I said, logic models, et cetera. You can build this capacity, and that is coverable within stimulus funds. Additionally, you can also make requirements of your new providers. We're seeing this happen where as they're using ARP or title or federal funds, they're starting to require implementation and evidence reports be included within that purchase. and it improves implementation. It does equip you. All of those options are both directly fundable through the ESSER dollars, any level of those. But Title I, Title IV, and other funds do have call outs for this type of work within ESSA as well. So it is sustainable from there. The last two E's I want to highlight before we go to questions. One, the fourth one is efficiency. And looking at the efficiency of what you're doing is really critical. Systems are inefficient at the junctions. They tend to be inefficient where they connect with other things. You may call these silos, right? But connecting the silos. So if you use your funds to help streamline in high impact ways to increase efficiency, for example, your communications tools across your schools, teachers, and families, your internal processes like request workflows, or some of the work that Project Unicorn, we and others are providing to help support providers and vendors, compliance, those things can all obviously interoperability, streamlining that lowers costs and can be a valid use of those funds. Additionally, when you use tools like ours, you can analyze. I encourage folks to look at the total cost of ownership for their education technology, not only licenses and the professional training that goes with that, which should be in the direct cost, to be clear. But if you're going to put training into indirect, but you may have other costs around contracting, management, measurement, compliance, etc. You can analyze those. This is a screenshot you can see based on the number of licenses used. In this particular example, the total licensing cost was about 10K, but they had potential cost savings, unused licenses, looking at what their costs per student were, they can reallocate or renegotiate those contracts. By adjusting, just to say, this isn't negative towards products or towards districts. This is about having data to quickly make decisions about what's best for students, and you can adjust implementations and budgets. As you do this over time, during the 3 years of ARP, you can plan and start to identify sustainability or additional funds. You may allocate funds in years 3 based on what you've learned in 1 and 2 with your evidence basis for things like multi-year purchases, education technology as well. And finally, the word that gets thrown around the most I feel like is effectiveness. It's the fifth. The other 4 need to be driving what effectiveness is. And think about when your organization talks about effectiveness, do you mean for instruction, for outcomes, operations, finance, all of the above? It might depend. It could be all or some of those at any given time. So by defining that, we'll make sure that you can address those as we move forward. The 6 aspects we see of effective EdTech ecosystems around the country have 6 aspects. And we actually recommend sometimes you can work on any of these, but we recommend first organize all the stuff and communicate. It's the Wild West. By getting organized and communicating to parents, teachers, students, not only is that lower headaches for you, it's actually lower cost, and it's a revenue generator, because one thing Scott and I have not highlighted, I don't think explicitly yet, is the highest impact, I think, on these funds over the year is going to be student retention. If your student levels, number of students in most states is what defines how much ongoing funding from the states, feds, et cetera, come in. So our data shows that a more organized, effective EdTech ecosystem leads to higher student retention. So start with organize and communicate, streamline and comply with your processes, and then ensure that you're analyzing and improving. You can start to analyze right out of the gate, but that'll provide a benchmark. But if you can't communicate about it, it's not going to impact your processes or what have you. So we encourage that. And one final tool that we provide is called Impact. This is rapid cycle evaluation technology. I've referenced some of the different ways that it works, but I think what we're seeing with this strategic planning, this technology integrates usage data, student achievement information, all your pricing information, and runs the equivalent of a third-party evaluation in a matter of minutes instead of months. It decides if it should run a correlative, comparative, or control trial, if it's a level 3 or level 2 or level 1. And more importantly, it provides curriculum instruction, data they need to inform and improve teacher training, student development, and curricular decisions. Technology has the data and tools they need and can start to operationalize around that. And obviously with finance, being able to effectively plan, budget, make decisions all throughout the year. This does not need to be an ex post facto situation. It's something that you can be making these decisions and should be throughout the year to inform not next year's students, but these students this year and during each of the coming years. So I'll stop there. I really think I appreciate, Scott, the guidance and input on the regulations. We are getting more clarity on this from here, but I'm looking forward to answering any questions and hope these tools can be helpful.
Great. Thanks so much, Carl and Scott. Tons of information. Lots I know that folks are going to want to go back on. And there's some appendix slides as well, Scott, that you included that are great with some great like tactical and practical examples, I think, of what districts and some LEAs are doing right now in terms of planning. I'm going to kick off with one of the questions from the chat, and then I have a couple questions that we got on Twitter, actually, for folks who couldn't attend but are going to watch. So if you don't mind, we got a couple of questions on Twitter that I'm going to spark in there. From one of our participants, are you planning to share a summary of reporting requirements per funding source for LEAs? Scott, is that information available right now? What the requirements are for funding source for LEAs? I know each state is going to have to do a plan for LEAs, so that's not yet certain, but any other information?
I think just guidance so far, but nothing specific. So I think there's a template that's out from Ed to start planning, but nothing specific yet from what that reporting is going to look like. But I'll share that. I think I can share it in the chat, so I'll give it a shot.
Great. The state template is definitely out, but not an LEA template.
Well, and I think we're seeing different conversations in different states about what's going to be required from the state up as well. So it's probably a moving target for the next little bit, but I think there is good guidance out there. Great to hear. So some questions that came in from the chat. So one from a pretty large district, I would say a top 50 district CIO, who wants to know if we have or have seen a good model of a planning team in a district to spend the money. So their superintendent is thinking about putting together a planning team. They are wondering if anybody else is doing that, or if you guys have heard of anybody who's doing that. I could say I know for large and medium districts that we've talked to, there are a few that are doing it at the cabinet level with some financial analysts sort of supporting that work. The others have pulled together teams, but it's been deputies across, but it has been across departments. So curriculum instruction, technology, finance, federal programs, SEL, health, facilities and services. It's been pretty cross-departmental so far from the ones that we've seen.
What's interesting, I sort of recall the early parts of the pandemic. I remember that a year ago or more, goodness, but how school districts came together at a leadership level to deal with the crisis on a daily basis. We've seen some cabinet level meetings on a daily basis, and then on the weekly basis, and then whatever they needed. But they communicated across the board what needed to be done that day, that week, that month, just to get through. but they built some sort of teams already based on the reactions they had to the initial just emergent nature of what was happening in the country to the pandemic. So that to say that culture, I'm hoping some of that culture can be, sort of pervasive into the planning for us coming out of this and using the funds effectively. Same sort of thing, cabinet level leaders across the board, but using those relationships and those skills they developed during the crisis to think about the opportunities that are coming down the pipe too.
So a tactical question, maybe Carl, you can answer this. From a CIO running about a 3,000 person district, wants to know if they should buy or upgrade Google Classroom to the Enterprise Edition, or if they should buy an LMS. What are you seeing districts doing there? That's a very tactical, precise question. I know we don't endorse products at Project Unicorn. You probably don't endorse projects at Learn. What should the CIO do to think about that question, maybe, or how should they do that?
I think first off, I think they're not the only ones asking that. What we're seeing across the country is pretty consistent challenge there. As we saw, most districts actually are, whether they know it or not, using more than one LMS. And that obviously puts strains. I think we are agnostic to the decisions around that. We are seeing a pretty significant growth on the Google side and investment from Google on what the LMS looks like. But we've also seen, I would suggest two things. One, I could say we're doing a number of EdTech audits, EdTech effectiveness audits, to help folks understand what's going on within their own district to inform these plans. It also has the benefit of setting sort of a benchmark for the beginning of ARP. So when they are reporting in a year, they'll know where they were and be able to show progress from wherever they were. Through that process, and this would lead into whether you do an audit with us or others, is I would recommend engaging with your getting teacher feedback and CNI feedback, seeing if there's an alternative that you want to consider, and making that decision not on your own, but with CNI and finance together. There are ways and some looking at total cost of ownership. And certainly peer districts might have some visibility, but almost all the peer districts are going through a similar challenge right now. So I would look at that question with your CNI team and finance team. And the free inventory dashboard will also give you visibility. Maybe folks have been using something else and you don't realize it. So just identifying that and asking, so why aren't you using this, or would you use this instead, to be able to define that. So I can't say which is best for any specific local, but all evidence is local. So gather a little bit of evidence and make the best decision you can.
Great. Scott, I think this question may be for you, Carl. Maybe you have some insights here. I'm not sure if it's a tech director or someone. I can't tell from their Twitter profile, but asking a question about providing hotspots to families certainly seems like an allowable cost, but asking about, isn't that what the new emergency broadband program is supposed to do? And should schools really be doing that anymore? Or isn't that no longer school's job? What should the schools do?
That's sort of a sticky one, but I mean, when you look at the actual, again,
going back to so much fun, Scott. They love to.
Yeah. That's why
they're in school. They're teaching, so they know that they know I'm going to ask these questions for them,
right? Because ARP requires having a plan to be in class 5 days a week. A, B, we have funding for hotspots for kids at home. Right? There's a natural tension there, but the funding is there. The funding's available. I think we'd have to look into what's the specific requirements and how would that feed into the plan that you have. There may be we know that some districts will be offering full 5-day schedules, but also have a concurrent virtual model as well. So that could help support those students
Yeah.
that are taking the virtual options.
I-
The funding's
Yeah,
there.
The emergency broadband benefit, which is the new like Lifeline program with the FCC, where to provide connectivity in the home. Any thoughts about that? Should schools be thinking about that? Should schools stay away from it? Any thoughts there?
I think sticky is the right framing. I would say,
Okay.
I guess I would say I do expect that we'll get more guidance. My understanding is both through, both through legislation with the infrastructure bill that's in Congress and, with the FCC currently has an interim chair. We should get more clarity on what that looks like. I would say that most districts should watch it to understand more. I don't think we've been provided enough clarity yet. But I think Scott's point of, defining your own strategy and what you're prioritizing and then activating, and allocating funds. The funds are there and flexible enough to use. I would expect that broadband, the EBB and even infrastructure funding will likely be eligible, but there's some TBD around that.
You both saying that we're still in this period of uncertainty around some of these buckets, and that we're going to have to kind of wait and see in some of these buckets around guidance. Is that a fair? But there's steps you can take now to plan.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's the point. We can't just wait for specific guidance. I think you draft a plan and know that it's going to change. And this is the way things will be for by a little while.
Great. I want to give us time to sort of just have like a final comment. I'll use that as my final comment, that it seems like the best thing that we can do right now is step back and do the things that school districts can actually do, which is create cross-departmental, cross-functional teams here. And something we always say at Unicorn, which is, tech is never going to replace a great teacher, right? That technology is always in the service of great teaching and learning. Data interoperability is never going to replace great teaching and learning. It's really in the service of great teaching and learning. And so building a cross-functional team right now, bringing together your curriculum instruction team, your technology team, your, social and emotional, mental health, special education teams, all at the table. It's going to take all of us. We all need to be, if you will, all in to support students right now, including our parents, engaging our parents, engaging our communities, engaging our students even in what it means to return to school is going to be more important than ever. I can't wait to talk about the importance of data interoperability and bring my laminated 20-sheet password from my son's school out on the conference circuit as my artifact du jour for 2021, 2022. So get ready to see that beautiful red sheet of paper in person with my 20 passwords for 20 kindergarten apps, and why it's so important to think about interoperability just for signing in. Carl, leave us with a last word.
Yeah, we're in the midst of the largest single funding event in the history of education in the U.S. And if we don't, approach that with a strategy to address equity needs, we will have missed a massive opportunity to transition to what public education in the U.S. is always intended to be. And I think, strategize with your peers in your district around what you want to do. At present, there's not a ton of structure, but you get to put that in place until there is. And likely it's going to be easier to crosswalk with whatever guidance comes from that with your strategy, and you'll have more ownership of that. So encourage you to fund access, but measure engagement, and build the capacity to build your own evidence base for the decisions you're making within your organization.
Scott?
Ditto with all of that. We're optimistic. I know it's a huge lift. And we know there's some capacity concerns across the board at SEAs and LEAs, but we're seeing some great work take place, and we're looking forward to seeing what comes out of the efforts overall. No matter how challenging it is to get there, we know we're going to get there.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're so happy to say there's going to be a part 2 of this series, a webinar with some practitioners hosted by our colleagues from the Council of Great City Schools, who are actually going to be releasing at the end of May, early June, some practical tips and tools, including some RFP documentation, some checklists, and some templates for folks to be using at the LEA and school district level for procurement of systems. And then we'll be joined with the CIO of Portland Public Schools to talk a little bit about how he's used procurement as a mechanism to modernize his data ecosystem. Procurement is sexy, I promise, and it can help you modernize what you're doing and make what you want to accomplish for students a reality. Just going to share our contact information. If you haven't already signed the Project Unicorn Pledge, make sure you do that. Click it now if you want. Make sure you sign up. Lots of access to resources, including scholarships, as we all get on the road again. And we'll be doing boot camps this fall. Really excited to kick off some boot camps. For those of you who are going to watch this asynchronously, I know who you are because you're tagging me on Twitter. And we hope we answered your questions. Go ahead and if you have more questions, hit us up on Twitter, send us an email. We hope that we got to most of your questions. We hope that this is valuable for you. And if you need anything else, don't ever hesitate to reach out to the Project Unicorn team. We're here to support you. And I know Carl and Scott, one of the reasons we love them as unicorns is because they serve districts and schools. They love this work. They are here to make sure that schools and districts are really their best selves and are working with equity at the heart of what they're doing for their students. And so they're here to help you too. Please, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know that they're here to help you as well. Thank you so much to Carl and Scott for joining today. We really appreciate you both. And thanks so much, Project Unicorn family. We'll see you for part 2, end of May, early June. Bye-bye.